My name is Annetta van der Kamp-Wright. I'm the editor of the Jewish Press. I'm here with Rachel, and I have to look at my sheet because titles. Rachel is the JFO's Director of Development, and Margot Parcel over there is our Engagement Associate. And we are here with Ariel O'Donnell, our author of the day. Welcome, Ariel. This is part 4 in the local author series, and welcome everybody at home. Welcome everybody here. Rachel, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Sure, thank you. So many of you probably already know Ariel. Ariel is our Director of Communications for the IHE. She writes under the name A.J.K. O'Donnell. And she's the author of 3 collections of poetry, Nicotine and Other Foolish Mistakes, which was published in 2015. This Void Beckons, published in 2018, and her newest work, Amaranthe, which was published this year, 2022. Ariel was the recipient of the Youth Courage Award from the Colin Higgins Foundation in 2016 and toured the United States with the collection This Void Beckons. She spoke at the Last Bookstore in LA and all the way over to the Harvard Coop in Cambridge. Ariel is currently a senior at UNO. And I think at least one of her teachers is here today. She's studying religion and philosophy there. In this year, 2022, she started training to become a death doula. And she's receiving a professional certificate from the University of Vermont. After she receives that, she'll start offering doula services in conjunction with her artistry. She lives here in Omaha with her cats, Kaczynski and Kafka.
Oh, those are great cat names.
Great cat names.
Both Jewish.
And she can be found most days writing at coffee houses here around Omaha. So welcome, Ariel.
Thank you. As Rachel said, I am from Omaha. And I am a student at UNO. This collection that we're going to be mostly talking about today is my 3rd collection of poetry. And it is very much a collection rooted in the divine feminine and seeing the feminine side of God and of scripture and of history and things like that. So that's really the root of this collection. I went to Westside High School. I graduated from Westside High School, and I grew up Roman Catholic, but I converted to Judaism, which is a part of the story. And so that's a little bit more about me and my life here in Omaha. And yeah, we can dive into questions.
I think before we
Yes.
dive into the questions, we're going to have you read some of the
Oh,
poetry.
yes.
So that the people at home and the people here in the room kind of know what that sounds like,
Okay.
and then we will pluck it apart.
Okay,
So
perfect.
the floor is all yours.
So I have
What are you
2
gonna read for us?
I have 2 poems for you, and I'm trying to make sure I'm talking loud enough for the people outside the room, but I have 2 poems for you and a small snippet of a piece of prose from this collection. This collection is 24 poems and 3 pieces of prose. I live with OCD and numbers are really important to me, and 24 is my lucky number. So almost every collection that I write has 24 poems or 34 poems, but these are just 2 of the poems from the collection. So this first one is called Woman of Water. From the shadows she awakens, for she can only be seen in the dark, but she is a creature born of the 3 ancient fires, cloaked in moonlight, access of primordial blaze. She is a powerful silence, a gentle rumble, one that moves with water, as water. A candle presented from her palms is placed to float on a clear surface. Scarlet wax fractures dancing deep into holy depths, as does nourishing blood. With rhythmic precision, she pours salt of the earth, lavender from distant lands, cinnamon from foreign forests sinking into the sea. Steam rises, twirling amidst broken light as sacred song. As the drums beat, she enters illuminated waves, ones of her own conception. The cleansing begins, a consecrated burning, when water knows the touch of flame, purifying her body, pulsating around her as cosmoses are created from chaos. Water rushes between her thighs, sliding through silky hair, curling amidst creases of skin. She is smooth as she is rough, for she is of balance. Her hips have birthed children some will never know. Pain, love, grief, and joy, they call her mother. She has earned the right to name them, given each life, witnessed them grow, held their hands and quieted their fears. Arching her back, she cups water into her hands and releases rain into spiraling skies. When she submerges, her curls unfold, cascading as ink from overturned wells, for her body is poetry. Through echoing stillness, a chorus emanates. Voice of a woman harmonizes in worship. When she can no longer hold air, she resurfaces, surging a typhoon around her body, whipping her hair back. Golden brown sun, mane of the lioness, regal crown of her ancestors, proudly falling to rest down her spine. Bare breasts drip with the promise of rebirth. She is life giver to the weary, goddess to the wandering, guardian of souls. From the water, she retrieves the candle, mutters an incantation, and with a patient longing returns to the shadows. But she is of ancient fire, born of water, bound by a cleansing sea, prepared for the awakening. Thank you. So that was the first poem that we can talk more about in a little bit. Is the root of that is it's about a trans woman, a transgender woman taking a bath. And then this poem was written inspired by my grandmother, who actually just recently passed away into memory in February of this year. So I remember her hands most. They were thick like mine, worn like mine, laden with stars, gems of the highest heavens. They had once held our world, cradling all cosmoses in a single grain. She promised her descendants would shower the earth. From her womb would unfold all nations. There will come a time after the great darkness when they will rise, with their big bones, wide hips, thick legs, strong hands, tallness, thunderous voices. As fire spreads forth, so too shall the lineage of the mother, rattling every seam and foundation, reclaiming that which was stripped, deemed unclean, unworthy, sent to the shame of silence, bent for the master, plundered, buried where no one would disturb, forgotten, split the heavens, drain the stars, rebuild the broken body, heal the land. They will bellow, returning the mother to her throne. And then this is the last small snippet, and this is prose. So this really, to give you a quick rundown, the 3 short stories go through my experience of healing, experiences of pain, and they kind of go through the lineage of also myself, my mother, and my grandmother. So the holiness of like the maternal line, and this is in the 3rd story, and the setting is a small hut on a mountaintop, and the protagonist, the main character, has just spoken with the divine feminine. So the divine like feminine side of God. Yeah, okay. She can see what appears to be a small kitchen. Near the fireplace, a tiny black kitten snuggles himself in a circular position. How precious, the woman thinks to herself. The woman journeys to the front door and gives the wooden frame a hesitant knocking. There is no answer, so she proceeds to do so again. Still, there is no answer. Finally, she gives the door one more message of presence. Nothing. Weighing her options, she decides to enter the hut. The door creaks, a soothing sound as it opens, and the woman steps into the entry space. A fire is burning gently in the center of the back wall, where the small kitten stirs. Awakening, the kitten stretches and yawns. It gazes up at the woman and seems to smile, as though he expected her. From the kitchen, a scrumptious smell trails through the rest of the house. The woman walks over to the kitchen and searches for where the delicious scent is coming from. She realizes the oven is on and opens the door. Inside sits the most beautiful braided bread the woman has ever seen. Thank goodness, thinks the woman, I'm famished. Above the oven hangs a pair of mismatched oven mitts the woman retrieves. She pulls the loaf out of the oven's belly and places it on the counter. Opening up random cupboards, she searches for a platter to place the bread on. In the last cupboard she opens, there is a gorgeous silver circular tray. This is perfect. She lights the candles on the table and takes a moment to be present in this piece. She closes her eyes, picturing all that has happened to her. Taking a deep breath, she begins to sing an old melody. Her eyes remain closed as her voice lifts and twirls into the air. The woman begins to twist side to side, rocking forward and backward, overcome with a sense of profound peace. Imitating the flames upon the table is as though the woman has become a flame herself. Outside in the back courtyard of the house, a beautiful malice tree blooms. It looks like a woman in worship, a woman chanting a primordial song, a woman bathed in amaranthine light. Thank you.
Ariel,
Yes,
thank you for sharing your gift with us
thank
today.
you.
We have just a few questions so that the audience can know more about the process that you go through with finding this inspiration within yourself. So can you tell us about your writing process, please? And what does that look and feel like when you do write these beautiful things?
I am a habitual bird. So I'm an early bird and a night bird, or not a night bird, night owl, that's the word. So I call myself a habitual bird because I either am up really, really early or up really, really late. And I'm usually writing at that time. And so my sleep schedule is never normal. I find most of my inspiration at nighttime. I find I'm most productive at nighttime or in coffee shops. Shout out to Bad Seed if you've ever been there. If you haven't, you should go. It's downtown. It's where I spend most of my time writing. Or Mr. Toad's. They have a beautiful patio downtown. But I enjoy patios and I enjoy being outside at night. During the winter, I like to sit on our deck and just think. A lot of my poems and a lot of my poetry and images come from just contemplation, and I'm very much a person who, I don't do it as much anymore, but I used to keep a small notebook of phrases. So I'd think of a phrase like or an image like a crumbling cigarette or a tree twisting and build a poem from that image or from that phrase. So it's very much rooted in the word. Words. I like to think that words are kind of vessels. So sentences, I'm much more of a poet than a prose writer. But when I write prose, a lot of times the sentences will be rooted in a single word. So if I need the word blood, I need to figure out how to create a sentence to bring that word in. Or if I need the word drink or the word cup, or whatever it is to bring that image and that metaphor are rooted around a lot of the words that I use. So, yeah.
So in reference to words, do you prefer writer or poet?
I actually use the word wordsmith. I know that's really pretentious of me, but I like to think that I'm an artist who uses words, and that poet, writer, author are all totally okay words, but I tend to use the word wordsmith when I introduce myself to people.
I think I like that because it includes the and concept. Like, I think anytime we ask either or, we tend to limit ourselves. you're all of those things and then some.
Mhm.
I do like wordsmith.
you.
So when you're writing and when it's happening and the magic is happening, is that mostly for you a solo endeavor, or do you fairly quickly try to pull other people in? Like, at what point do you bring in audience? Do you test, especially with poetry?
So if you end up reading any of my three works so far, how they've all been structured. I have written poems that I share with close friends and loved ones, but I also, all of these all of these collections, I actually kind of had an arc for them. So I knew I was trying to tell a story with the poems. And so these were written for an audience to communicate a story, to communicate a narrative. And this specific collection, Amaranthine, is rooted in kind of finding, well, to be completely transparent, it's very much about like finding holiness in mental illness, finding holiness in trauma, finding holiness in pain, finding holiness in suffering and rebirth and those kinds of concepts. And so I was trying to communicate that in the thematic arc that I created for the readers. So, yeah.
Holiness in mental health issues is something that we don't talk about ever. So thank you
You're welcome.
for bringing that to the forefront, because it does need to be addressed.
So when I knew we were doing this, I read your poetry. And then I heard it today, and I had a very, very different experience, right? After having read it and then hearing it. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between read poetry and heard poetry?
Yeah, so I started out writing poetry when I was like 13 or 14. And I began as a slam poet. So there's something in Omaha called Louder Than a Bomb. And I did that in high school. I started as a performance poet, and I have not had like the mental capacity to memorize poems and turn them into performance pieces in quite some time. But that's a very powerful way to communicate poetry. It's a way for people to kind of experience it from the author or from the writer, and hear it in a way that is indicative of how that author or how that writer felt about the poem. What I really love as a poet who writes poetry and then shares it in the written form is I will have people, for example, the poem I read about the transgender woman taking a bath and the holiness of her body. I had a person come up to me and actually I performed that poem. I actually performed it now that I'm telling the story. So it's a mixture of both, but I performed that poem at an open mic about 2 weeks ago. And I had a woman come up to me afterward and she was crying and she said that she had lost her daughter last year. And the line about that grief and joy and pain call something mother, like that touched her in that way. And I think one of the things I love about being a poet who writes and shares it in the written form too, is if I'm not reading the inflections or I'm not doing those things, people connect in ways to the poem that I had no way of knowing they would. And I really enjoy when people tell me that they connected to a poem in a specific way that I hadn't intended. So, yeah.
Well, it was, I will say, just personally, when I read it, I did it kind of quickly,
Mhm.
right? Like I do everything, kind of quickly. So it was so nice to hear you slow it down, just that difference just gave me a very different experience of the poem itself.
I'm a little fascinated with the possibilities that poetry allows the audience, because I'm listening to you and the first thing I think is mikveh. And I think I actually asked you at one point months ago, did you take a bath? And it was half jokingly, because I know you'd gone to the mikveh,
Mhm.
But that concept of rebirth is the first thing. But then you talk about that audience member, that's an entirely different story. And it's really wonderful how such a dense piece of text can evoke that many
No,
responses.
what I love, and as Jews, this experience of the Talmud or written form of prose and then scripture, this book kind of mimics that. So the poems are the scripture, and the dense experience of the divine, and the prose pieces, the short stories are like, okay, here's the conversation, or here's what's going on, or here's the story, the anecdote, or the narrative part of the collection, whereas
Commentary.
the commentary, so.
And at the same time, the fact that you can talk about a few words and a few short lines forever.
Mhm.
Yeah, that seems very familiar. So, and I think I kind of know where your answer is going to go. I initially wrote down the question of whether if your work as a whole, your whole body of work has a message regarding the feminine, regarding Judaism, regarding childhood trauma, as we talked about when we did the pre-talk for today's event. Where would you think that central message lands for you personally?
For this collection specifically, I would say that the message specifically is that all we inherit is holy. All that we inherit is holy, even the pain, even the suffering. What we choose to do with what we inherit is the power, is what is the choice. So what we inherit is a holy gift, even if it's good but not, I don't like the word bad. So even if it's
Challenging.
hard, difficult, complex, or if it's easy breezy, but everything we inherit has value. It depends on what we do with it, how we enact it, that gives it power. Is probably the main message of this specific book, tied with the feminine, because it also, to kind of go on a little bit of a side note, when I converted to Judaism, and I don't know if any of your questions ask this, so if they do, tell me and I'll stop talking about it. But it's like my grandmother was a really important part of that story for me. And that translated into my mother and into me. And even though I don't have the maternal line of someone who's born Jewish, it became a way for me to honor my mother and a way to honor my grandmother and the mothers before them and all my foremothers, that my connection to Judaism didn't Judify, if that's a word, like Judify them, but it like,
I don't know if
it
that's
like-
a word, but we can make it.
it's a word, it's a word now.
It's a word.
Like it like gave context to the story of like, I understand the struggle of scripture and the struggle of all these things and my experience with God and my experience with my mother and my grandmother and these things, and they all kind of go together. And that's also a big part of this. People who read this book, and specifically the prose, who are Jewish or have familiarity with Jewish tradition and values, will understand, like, because there's a part in the book where before the braided bread is challah, right? Or there's a part before it where the woman takes a bath and goes under 3 times, which is the mikvah when I converted. So it's like, it kind of spiritualizes and mystifies and almost fantasizes a little bit, like the conversion process that I had of Judaism.
I just had a thought and then I lost it, so I'll look to you.
Thank you. Ariel, do you think your poetry or your prose elicits more of a response from your audience? What has been your experience?
I would say my poetry. I would say my prose, I actually am fairly new at. Like I haven't done a whole lot of prose, and I get emotional responses from both, because even though when I write prose, it's poetic prose. It sounds like a poet wrote it, and so it's very much like I don't know, I kind of am one of those people, and I know it sounds maybe a little violent, but I kind of like to like take my pen, like jab it into my reader's like throat and then like twist it and be like, feel the pain, like feel the emotion, like just feel it, because it's hard to carry it alone, and I want you to carry it with me or experience this with me. And so,
On your prose is still very intentional, like there is not a single word that is there as fluff.
no, oh, well, I do like fluff sometimes, let me tell you, I do like some fluff, but it's purposeful fluff, it's purposeful, I would agree, thank you. Because it's, I like to make, it's a struggle, but I put a lot of pressure on myself to sound both beautiful and intentional. And that can be a really hard line to walk. And I've had people edit my work and be like, this paragraph goes, and it's like, oh, but like, I know, no, it's my child, but yeah, so.
I'll tell you a secret, editors love slashing. We always think things are too long. They can be 200 words and we'll cut out 50 of them.
Oh, Lord.
So Ariel, a little off script, but you
Yes.
speak so lovingly and beautifully about your mom and your grandmother.
Mhm.
Are those pearls? Do they belong?
These are not, okay, really funny story, really fast.
No,
I went through a phase, so when I first started transitioning, I thought I had to dress like a powerful, rich woman. I know that sounds strange, but to like not, it was like a mask. It was, if I look like I'm powerful, then no one will call me names or no one will be rude to me. And so I went through this phase of, these are fake, but well, I think they might be like, they're fake, they were like $20, but they're actually glasses things. So I thought if I like, and I just clipped them, and so I thought if I like looked like, you know, like aged and loving and like powerful and maternal, people would be like nice to me. So I was like 19 with like these glasses things, like a librarian, thinking I was this powerful thing, and now I'm like, tone it down, girl, it's fine. So yeah,
I love that.
Thank
That's a
you.
delightful story.
I do have some, I recently, I'm not wearing them now, but when my grandmother passed away, her sister was able to give me these baker's pins, because my great-great-grandmother, Anna Spakowski, was a baker, and she would wear these baking, like not these, but these like brooches kind of on her apron, and they've been passed down, and so they're, and if I ever get to go back to, like if I want to take them with me if I go on traveling, to kind of take her on the world, because she was the immigrant of the family and kind of, so yeah,
Thank you.
thank you.
And jewelry should be worn,
Of course.
not sit in a drawer and gathering dust.
We were made to accessorize. Actually, that's in
Yeah.
Steel Magnolias. There
Right.
was a line in Steel Magnolias. I just watched it. She says, the only thing that keeps us different from the animals is that we can accessorize.
That's a great line. So a lot of this like keeps bringing me back to identity.
Mm,
Your transgender identity, your Jewish identity, your female identity. And I think a lot of us sometimes feel like we wear a lot of different hats as human beings. We tend to kind of do that to ourselves. How do you view yourself? How do you integrate your different hats?
mhm.
Like, who is Ariel?
This totally is. So this was originally going to be a collection just about the holiness of the trans woman, or like the trans feminine and the queer body and the queer person. I like the word queer. I know it has a history, but I am a person who reclaims it. So that's what this originally was going to be about. And then in 2019, some really icky stuff happened, and this book became like a mixture of my personal identity and also working through new experiences of pain and trauma, and how they kind of connect together. So I would say I very much identify as a wordsmith, like we've said. I think identity is is a palette for us to communicate who we are to the world, but it's ever changing and it's fluid. And I was born a middle-class Catholic boy, and I'm a Jewish woman. So like, it's like identity really doesn't exist, and it exists, and it's really important. And it's a way for us to communicate our values and a way for us to communicate who we are. And I think I will continue to investigate that my entire life. And I think that's what our purpose is, to understand ourself. Spinoza said that the third category of knowledge is the self, is to understand the self. And if you can understand the self, you can understand the other. Not, of course, perfectly, because we can never understand each other perfectly. But if we can understand and know ourselves and be rooted in ourselves and grounded in ourselves, we have the capacity to open ourselves to understand others and be fully compassionate and empathetic.
That's a beautiful message.
Yeah. So how has your poetry helped you become more of your authentic self, or has it? What part has it played?
I'm in therapy. I go to therapy. I believe in therapy. I think it's great. But also writing is kind of a compulsive therapy for me. And so it allows me to kind of work out my own thoughts and my own images and codes and whatever it is into words, to understand myself better. And I love, like, for example, one of my favorite things about my poetry that I like people, and I'm not saying like you don't know me, but like in the first poem I read, when it says born of the three ancient fires, like it's like this like really profound sounding line. It's just like, no, I'm a Leo, my moon is Aries, and my rising is Sagittarius. So all three of my horoscopes are fire signs. So it's like this like way to like kind of communicate a part of myself that's not whimsical, but like parts of the poems will mean an image to someone, but mean something totally different to me. And I kind of hide a part of, not hide, I don't know that word, but I embed the art with myself. And I communicate myself to people, and especially people who know me really well will like see that part of the poem differently. So, yeah.
That's really one of the best ways I've ever heard anybody explain how writing is layered.
Mhm.
Wow.
It's very layered. It's like a cake, but not as yummy. It's yummy. It's
It can be yummy.
So Ariel, who are some authors or poets that have influenced you?
So my cats are both Kaczynski and Kafka. I don't know if you know who Jerzy Kaczynski was. He committed, I think the correct terminology now is he completed suicide, but he completed suicide in like the 90s or the 80s. I believe it was the 90s, but he wrote one of my all-time favorite books called The Painted Bird. He might have plagiarized the entire thing. So it's very controversial and it's a very messy situation, but that book just very much spoke to me. I read it in high school. Kafka, The Metamorphosis is one of my favorite books, The Castle. I'm reading Dostoevsky right now for the first time, and I really enjoy him. But Toni Morrison, these are all prose people though. So I'd say the poets that I read, you might know her, Rachel McKibbins. She is very guttural, and that's what I love about her. Is she's also the kind of person who will like stick the knife in the gut and twist it and be like, it's still beautiful. I know that sounds horribly gross, but like it's painful, but like these are honest truths and these are difficult. And like I, in the collection, there's a line about, stillborn children, because my grandmother had a stillborn, and in genealogy research that I did, her mother's sister was stillborn. So it's like stillborn children were like a lineage, not curse, but a lineage pattern in my family. struggling with pregnancy was a pattern in my family. And so like all these different like guttural things. Rachel McKibbins is a really good guttural poet. I also I struggle with reading poetry because as I mentioned earlier, I live with OCD and I get really scared that I might plagiarize on accident. Like I'll forget where I heard something and be like, did I think that myself? And then I'll like compulsively look it up online. And if I don't find it, I'm like, well, I must not have plagiarized it. I must have had that authentic thought. But like, yeah, so I haven't read a lot of poetry recently. So Rachel McKibbins was really big for me, and Andrea Gibson. Andrea Gibson is also, these are both slam poets who also write poems. Yeah, so.
Well, the most important poet and writer that we want to know about is you. Where do we access your beautiful pieces?
So this collection, it's been a long time coming. It was supposed to come out last year. And then I got COVID the week it was going to come out, and it was just it was just a mess. So I put it off for one more year. It'll be out in August. You can pre-order it now on my website, www.ajkodonnell.com. And I also have a podcast that I talk about my last book in. My last book was kind of a journey through the hero's archetype, and seeing it as our experience ourselves, that we all live in the archetype of the hero. And like we can live that pattern out. And so that's what the podcast kind of goes through, is that journey. And then I believe it'll be on Amazon as well. And if it's on Amazon, you can order it on barnesandnoble.com. So those are like the main spots.
And we will put some of those links on our social media as well. So if anybody later on wants to find out or look on the Jewish Press Facebook page.
Sounds
Put
like
it on there. So what's next? What wild plans?
I am currently working on, and this is not biographical, but I'm working on a novella. So it would be my first like actual piece of prose. And it's about, without giving too much away, a transgender woman who comes home to take care of her ailing mother who has dementia, who abused her. So it's like this complex story about grief and forgiveness and love and just heavy things. But I love philosophy, and so I love to like interject a lot of my short stories with philosophical conundrums and philosophical conversations about what ethics are and what it means to forgive and what it means to grow and what mercy is and things like that. So I'm working on that, and then I'm also I think my next collection of poetry, this was like my journey through the divine feminine and Judaism and things of that nature. But I think my next collection of poetry is going to be more like a collection of contemplations about God as a woman and God as mother, because I think that's really powerful. And I think it's important that we talk about maybe not God as mother, but just like divinity as having a mothering side, or like the things that we attribute the divine and holiness. We've kind of, as much of us know, and I don't know it in the same way, but it's been harmed. Femininity has been harmed for ever.
Well, and without
so,
getting into too much of that, I do think living in a nation where Christianity is the norm, which is very male dominated and has been throughout history. Judaism has always, to me, left much more room for the feminine. There's a lot of Jewish teaching to be done about the feminine side of God. God is not a male or a female. God is so much bigger than that. So I can see how those things kind of mix. I have a question.
Yes.
About your road through being transgender towards femininity. I can speak. English. Femininity. As a Jewish community, where is our work as far as being accepting? Which should like be the very, very baseline. But beyond that, how can we as a community grow with you, grow for you? I feel like a lot of times we still get stuck in talking about acceptance, which is, like I said, the bare minimum. Where is our work as the community?
I think to give it in a way where it's been really good is before I even finished my conversion, I'm a member at Bethel, and I went into Bethel to meet with Hazan. And there was like, it was one of my first times in Bethel, actually, I think. And there was like a pride poster. And it was like, we're gonna be walking in pride. And I remember just this moment, this feeling of like profound, not excitement, but just like gratefulness, because growing up Catholic, no, that didn't happen. And so no pride posters. And so like knowing that my spiritual community would also communicate a love for my gender identity or my sexual identity or other identities that I have. I think where we can work on it as a community when it comes to, trans issues or any marginalized people is understanding that everything is interconnected and everything, like if we support, trans people, but we don't support people of color, then we don't support trans people. If we don't support the marginalized among us, then we don't support the marginalized among us. So just kind of understanding when we have conversations about, how to better, because like acceptance is putting in not a transgender bathroom, but like having a shared bathroom policy or like a communal, like a bathroom policy that is affirming to transgender people as well. That's acceptance. Like radical love is like having events like this, or like including trans people and Jews of color and marginalized people in our community and outside of our community in the conversations that we're having, and listening to each other and loving each other and having difficult conversations, but still holding on to the hope and the love. So hope and love, peace. I'm just kidding.
Well, thank you, Ariel.
Yes.
Thank you so much. We'd like to open it up to the room. If you have questions for Ariel, Jen?
So I think this is the first time I've listened to poetry. I've never been to a poetry reading. I automatically closed my eyes. I visioned everything. I was so relaxed. So it was, thank you. But two things. One, you read three things. Were all of them prose? Were all of them poems? What was what? Because I don't have any idea. And then Greek mythology. And then in the feminine of Greek mythology. And then when I read when you read the first one, I wanted to know all about the women in your life, because you put us way up here. That was my visual. And so now I'm fascinated, want to know about your mother, your grandmother. So that's all my questions.
No. So the first two pieces were poems and the last was prose. I have a very complicated relationship with my mother. It's gotten much better as we've gotten older. But I think understanding her at a level of compassion and love, and understanding that we all, like, not that she has flaws, we all have flaws, but just like understanding the difficult things, because when I was 6, I didn't understand what it meant to be a mother. I didn't know, and I don't know now in the way that she does, but I understand that motherhood is really difficult, and that there's no such thing as perfection, and that she has all of her own 60 years of experiences pain and grief and loss and love and all these things. And so seeing her as a human. And then also a lot of the inspiration, I didn't see my grandma. I was very close to my grandmother as a little kid. She was my favorite grandmother. She, not that I have another grandma. I love both my grandmothers. But she was very important to me, and she is the reason I converted to Judaism, or one of the reasons. But she, when she was passing, I had this really powerful experience to like be both present with her for the last 3 years of her life, and then also watch her be present with my mother and see like this, like, oh, you never outgrew this, or like you're holding this pain still, and watching it be a very complex relationship. So of course my grandmother was on this pedestal for me, and my mother was this person that I was like really directly in contact with, and was always like, but then it was like, oh, you have that relationship with your mother, and your mother's relationship with you is complicated. But to me, she was grandma, and she was fun, and she was this loving woman, and she is loving. They're all both loving. But like, it was this ability to like see like, oh, they're all human, and they're all complex, and to give love and to communicate that love for them was a big part of my journey to Judaism. I actually wrote in my conversion paper, because my mother's Catholic. Actually, as a fun story, really fast, my mother converted to Catholicism to marry my father. My grandmother converted to Methodism to marry my grandfather, and my last grandmother converted to Catholicism to marry my grandfather. So it was like I come from women who convert. I come from women who convert, and so like connecting with my mother as a person who's like, you converted for a man, so did you, and so did you. I converted for me, and like that power. And to kind of feel empowered and heal something, because not to harm Christianity, but Catholicism really hurt me. It was not a good experience for me. And Judaism very much allowed me to like conceptualize my relationship with my mother and my grandmother like challah. And that's one of the themes in this book is three becoming one, three braids, three women becoming one. Not I am my mother and I am my mother and my grandmother, but like all three of us becoming like healing this connection together. So yeah.
Did you have a question?
I was curious, you grew up Catholic. I'd like, if you don't mind, to tell us what the involvement you had as a child in Catholicism. And it sounds to me like perhaps you had some issues and problems with Catholicism that made you think about moving to a different religion. You picked Judaism. So I'm curious what issues you might have had with Catholicism, and did you consider other religions before you landed on Judaism?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I did. So I grew up Catholic. I grew up very Catholic. So my dad's 6 out of 10 kids. My last name's O'Donnell. So that's like Irish Catholic 101. And my dad was 6 out of 10 kids, and his dad was 16 out of 16. I know. So and my grandmother, it's one of the best things ever. She had 10 children, and she's like this tall, and she's just like tiny. And she had 10 kids in like 11 years or something like that. So I grew up very Catholic, and I wanted to be a priest. I was always a very spiritual child, a very mystical child, a very religious child. And when I realized I was queer well, I knew before this, but like when I had my first, I don't know if this is oversharing, but I had like a crush on a boy in 5th grade, and I was like, like infatuated. And like, then I started going to confession for it. And I don't know if you're familiar with confession, but it's like, it's just a way to like confess your sins and then be forgiven for them. And so from the age of like 5th grade until, well, in high school, because I graduated from West Side, but I went to Creighton Prep for 2 years. My dad went to prep. So it was like the family thing. I would go and I would confess the sin of being queer or being gay. And just like carried this intense weight and this intense burden. I was also a very talkative child, and I don't know if you're like if anyone's basically, there's this thing called the sign of peace, and it's during mass, and it's a long story, but I forgot to give it to my teacher one day, and this like marked me for a long time. She did not like me because I think a lot of my teachers knew I was a queer child, because I flaunted it. I didn't hide it. I was very, very colorful and exciting, and powerful, but no, I'm just kidding. But she was like, you have the devil in your heart, because I forgot to give her a sign of peace. And so it was just like very like harmful rhetoric to like young queer kids. And it was funny because it came from my religion teachers, who I really idolized because I was really religious, and I still believe that a lot of Catholicism is, a lot of the dogma is beautiful. I think a lot of how it's practiced, and I think the institution itself is really harmful. I think a lot of the symbolism is beautiful, and the lineage, but I think it's extremely harmful, and it has a history tied to a lot of harm around the entire globe. But so I left Catholicism in junior year when I moved to West Side. I transferred to West Side, and this was the first time I ever had Jewish classmates. And I was invited over to make latkes on Hanukkah. I had this beautiful conversation with a friend in my grade outside of Crane Coffee, RIP. They're gone, but and we talked about Judaism for hours. And at that time, though, I really identified as more like I lived by Buddhist philosophies. I was really interested in Buddhist philosophies, but I wasn't in a community. And about 4 years after high school, I really missed religious community. I believe in the God of Abraham, or I believed in the God of Abraham, like in that sense. And so I was like, well, I can't go back to the Catholicism. And so I actually looked at Islam for a little while, and considered Islam. But what kind of rang true for me, and it's a really complex story that we don't even have the time for at this point, which is okay. But what was the push for me to look into Judaism deeper? Because for me, I thought, because a lot of Catholicism, at least the experience I had, was the Old Testament, quote unquote, which is the Tanakh and the Torah, is like the vengeful God, is the God who hates the gays, is the God who's like caused this root of harm. And so I didn't immediately think of that, but my grandmother, when she visited us when we were kids, told us a story that some of our ancestors, because she was Russian, were Jewish, and that memory came up for me. And so I was like, I wanted to, so Judaism, my conversion to Judaism began as a kind of a family research project that turned into a faith journey. So, yeah.
How old were you when you realized that being queer is not something that should be confessed to as a sin?
I'm still learning that. It's still something that I struggle with. I still struggle with like a lot of queer experience because of just years of shame. This is not like me trying to parade Catholicism as this like whack institution, but like there are people who, and they're actually mystics, but like they'll whip themselves, right? There's almost this like I was convinced that the only way for me to live in the afterlife or live and be loved by God was to die a martyr.
Hmm.
So like I thought I would have to die for my faith to like, because that was the only way I could go to heaven as a queer person. And so it's like really ingrained in you and it's really difficult to like undo. So but therapy is great.
Mark, are there any questions?
Nothing in
from
the chat so far.
There's nothing in the chat, because we're almost out of
You have a
time.
question?
You have a question?
I have two questions
Yeah.
and they may be a little too bulky to actually. The first one is, how does the sacred feminine that informs who you are as a person inform the way you inhabit your Jewish faith?
Mm.
The second one is, how do you envision your future as a leader in the Jewish community?
Ooh,
I like that. Thank you.
that's a great question.
I think so. There's actually, and I technically, and I wrote that I rewrote it, but there's the end of the book. The end of my book is Isaiah 56 verse something and something, and it's basically about eunuchs, which would be what I am, but not anymore, but not really, but like it's like the queer one, like a word for someone who's more queer, and it talks about how that there will be a monument for people who are eunuchs or people who can't have children, queer people, quote unquote, better than sons and daughters, and it's almost like this worthiness of queer people, and then in that same line it talks about the foreigner coming to the mountain and binding themselves to God. So it's basically like in the same few verses, it talks about queer people, and it talks about queer people and talks about converts. And so it's like, and the reason I talked about rewriting is I changed the pronouns to she because I thought it was radical. I was like, woo! But I think this idea that the divine feminine is with the oppressed, is with the harmed, is with the aggrieved, the grieving, comes from also my own experience, because my father left us when we were kids, and my reading of God, even now, is as someone who is both nurturing and loving and cares about, his people, but also like angry and pissed off and complex. And it's like, oh, that's kind of like my mom. So it's like this understanding that God is a woman, but not a woman, but like is like like the divine feminine part of God, and understanding that both exist and putting them back together, the God who abandons us, the God who loves us, the God who's feminine, the God who's masculine, like it's all one. It's just one. And we can tap into those experiences and those parts of the divine that heal us, that nurture us. And what I needed was to feel holy. And I think one of the other kind of messages of this book is, and I know it's very self-serving because it's a self-serving book. It's not a memoir, but it's part memoir in the sense that it's inspired by my life, is this understanding that as a transgender person, as a Jewish person, as a woman, all these different identities that you were asking about earlier, all these marginalized or pieces of me or whatever it is, tall, white, whatever the part of attribute of me, it's holy.
With good hair.
Oh, thank you. Got it from my mother. And actually, it's really funny. The product I use is called Not Your Mother's Curls. And so we laugh about the fact that they are my mother's curls, but it's like, that's the name of the brand. But I think the divine feminine allows for a lot more of a radical conversation about divinity. I took a Hinduism class last semester, and it was beautiful. It's called the Diva Gita, and it's basically this like prayer as the universe, not just like So it's like if God is the universe and all these things or whatever you want to argue it, it's like instead of, it's like it's a mother and we are inside of her, like her womb, like the divine feminine. And that was like a very healing piece of literature to read for me. And then to wrap up really fast this question, the question of what I see myself as a leader in the Jewish community. I plan on going to grad school in a year to get my MDiv, because then to go back to your question, I wanted to be a priest and I thought about being a rabbi. And then I kind of settled on going to an interreligious MDiv program and doing death work. So like we talked about earlier, I trained to be a death doula. I'm getting a professional certificate in December. And I want to like focus on aging and death ritual, specifically for queer people, because I think a lot of us have been hard, not us specifically because we haven't died yet, but our people have been harmed in the death ritual in the world and in the death world. And so I want to do a lot of work with that and stay involved in my Jewish community, because I love being Jewish. It's one of my favorite parts of Challah and Shabbat. Like having Shabbat dinner at my home is probably, it is the best part of the week. Everything slows down. One of my favorite quotes is Shabbat is a palace in time. It's probably a very common quote, but it's a beautiful quote. And it's just that idea that it's like this place to find refuge in the arms of a mother.
That brings us full circle.
Yeah.
I think. If nobody else has any question, we are definitely at time.
Okay.
So thank you.
Thank you.
You've given me so much to think about, and I've actually made some notes, and you and I will talk.
Okay.
Thanks everybody for coming, and that's it.
Yeah, there's cookies.